Hello and welcome to the Happy Project podcast. My name is Becky and today in this studio, it's just me. If you're watching the YouTube video, you recognize right away that this podcast probably feels a little bit different because, it's just you and me today. That being said, welcome to the podcast. We have a bit of an interesting topic today. So we're kind of starting a new series and we're going to be breaking down the Korean diaspora. The Korean diaspora is a term to describe the scattering of Korean people first throughout history and also geographically speaking. So you have Koreans who are in China now and in Japan. They'll be ethnically Korean but born and raised even through multiple generations in a country outside of South or North Korea. And so today we're going to break down a certain people group, part of the Korean diaspora, but they have their own term to describe who they are. And this is the Lai Dai Han. They are a group of mixed Koreans in Vietnam. And they're more specific than just ethnic Koreans growing in Vietnam. Lai Dai Han is a Vietnamese term for a mixed ancestry person born to a South Korean father and a Vietnamese mother. It's not the other way around. And this is due specifically to the genocidal gender violence by Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War. Now, if you're one of our Korean listeners, you may or may not have heard about this growing up because South Korea has done a pretty good job in making Vietnam War kind of the forgotten war. Similar to how in the US, the Korean War can sometimes be called the forgotten war in the US. Lai Dai Han are a rather small population. They're definitely a minority group. They're an ethnic minority as well. And because of the very difficult conflicted history, and it is still quite recent, so these people, the Lai Dai Han, often live at the margins of Vietnamese society. So let's break down the term, Lai Dai Han. And of course, I'm not using the accents quite properly. Vietnamese is a very complex language for me. I do have a couple Vietnamese friends actually. And when I was in Vietnam, I visited Da Nang, which is a beautiful city. If any of you guys have been there before, let me know and if you enjoyed it. I haven't been outside of Da Nang, but my friends there are natives of Da Nang, and so I got to really see the city from kind of a local's perspective, which was really cool. But that being said, I tried to learn a little bit of Vietnamese. I never quite got it right. So for any of my Vietnamese speakers who are listening to this episode and you're wondering, what's up with your pronunciation? Trust me, it's not from lack of trying. So anyway, let's break down Lai Dai Han. So Lai, L-A-I, it is a term that can mean hybrid. And this includes for an animal or a tree, pretty much anything mixed blood. But in this context, it's pejorative. So it's not a positive term when you're using it to describe people. Dai Han was the standard Vietnamese term for South Korea. So as you can see, Lai Dai Han, mixed blood South Korean. So how many Lai Dai Han are there today? In reality, we don't actually have an exact number. We don't really know. From my research, it could have been anywhere from 5,000 people to 30,000 people. As you can see, that's a really big spectrum. But we know that they are out there, and especially as recently as 2015, even 2020 and this year, people have started to become more outspoken about the plight of the Lai Dai Han people. So let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go back in time. Maybe we should go back to about 1964, and I'm jumping into my going back in time. I don't know what you want to call it, my transportation vehicle. Okay, here we go. Going back in time. Woo! Man, this is a lot less fun when it's just me. So here we are. We are now back in the 1960s of South Korea. 1964 was approximately when South Korea jumped into the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War, and again, if you're coming from Vietnam, you're probably not calling it the Vietnam War. We're using this term as it showed up in my research, which was mostly English-based, and also in Korea, they would call it the Vietnam War. South Korea had, it wasn't so recent. It wasn't so long ago that South Korea had come out of the Korean War. And we know immediately following the war, South Korea was poverty-stricken and was having a lot of struggles of their own and relied very heavily on their ally, the United States. And they were very strongly anti-communist at this point of time. Still, they are today. South Korea's president was Park Chung-hee. Now, Park Chung-hee is known today as being part of the dictatorship regime in South Korea. This will come into play in a little bit later. So at this point, South Korea was relying on the US quite a lot. And they decided to take an active role in the Vietnam War as an ally to the United States. They offered to help fight against the Vietnamese communists. And there's a lot of reasonings behind this, but the underlying cause was really to develop US and South Korean relationships. The US promised in return from help from South Korea to give them economic aid. Some critics would say, well then, weren't you just hiring Korean mercenaries? Really? Is that really what it was? That meant the US would not have so much control over the military troops. Now, at the time, Korean soldiers were also paid significantly higher if they decided to go to war than if they stayed in the motherland. And so this was another reason that would encourage Korean soldiers to be part of this quote-unquote cause, let's say, fight against communism. And in fact, South Korea was actually the second largest force in the coalition helping the US to be a part of the Vietnam War. After the US, who offered the biggest number of troops, came in South Korea. And the number was anywhere from 300,000 to 350,000 troops that were joining the American forces to fight the communist threat in Vietnam. So as you can imagine, yes, there was some criticism, and it seemed that they were just paid mercenaries. They were greatly feared by the Vietnamese. And that is because apparently, now we're going to step into a bit of speculation here, because neither government, Vietnamese government or South Korean government, wants to openly admit or release any documentation about what the South Korean army soldiers did against Vietnamese civilians during this time. But there are reports of massacres and atrocities that were committed against the civilians. And this was especially happening as neutral villagers were starting to join the Viet Cong. If you don't know what the Viet Cong is, they are also known as the National Liberation Front of Southern Vietnam, or basically they were an armed communist political organization in South Vietnam and Cambodia. So there was kind of this infighting happening in Vietnam, and it was very hard to tell the difference between a civilian and someone who was part of Viet Cong. This was another reason why some South Korean soldiers today will say, we weren't killing civilians, we were killing Viet Cong. As you can imagine, it gets a little bit messy. Now, some units were strictly instructed not to harm civilians. But at the same time, there were rumors going around that assaults and massacres were happening. To be honest, we know war is hell, and it doesn't seem to matter who is on what side, but atrocities are always committed. Well, the question is, now, did South Korea run prostitution facilities in Saigon and other cities during the Vietnam War? Why is this question significant? Because this is exactly what happened with Japanese occupation in South Korea. And South Korea is very outspoken against that. An anti-Korean sentiment Japanese magazine reported on the discovery of records suggesting that South Korea did have prostitution camps. And they quoted, apparently, a U.S. National Archives and Records Administration report stating, hey, South Korea also did this. So who are you to say bad things about Japan? Now, do you remember Park Chung-hee, who I mentioned at the beginning? Park Chung-hee was very authoritarian, very militaristic in his leadership style. So there were a lot of strict regulations on freedom of speech. So the military could essentially cover up any massacres or any crimes done against civilians. And anyone who came out to speak against that, well, they could have been tortured or imprisoned. So the South Korean government at that time had strict control over what news was coming out. And instead, it was a bit like propaganda. They were just saying how great the South Korean troops are, how they're heroes to fight for the anti-communist cause in Vietnam. And that also makes it a little difficult for current leaders to turn around and say, actually, South Korea did commit a lot of terrible atrocities. This is why you're going to see that there hasn't been a full apology yet. Now, let's come down to the Lai Dai Han. what happened to them? If it is true that South Korean soldiers committed these kind of atrocities and gender violence against women and left behind these mixed Korean, mixed Vietnamese children, the Lai Dai Han, what happened to them next? Because South Korea, if they don't want to openly acknowledge even today the atrocities that happened then, surely these children would have been forgotten as well. That seems to have been the case. And Vietnam's reaction to these mixed Korean kids, well, when it comes to children of war, not often handled well. So the Vietnamese women victims, now older, have started to come forward and actually talk about this. And it's not because of their own will, because nobody gave them a voice. Actually, it's because some civic groups from South Korea have sought out these stories. It goes way back to the 90s, and I'll get there in a moment. But first, let's talk about the Lai Dai Han, what happened to them. Dai Han, if you remember, is the Vietnamese term for South Korean at the time. Dai Han, they were remembered and viewed as symbols of terror and brutality if what the South Korean soldiers, all the terrible things they had done were true. So naturally, these women who had been violated by the Korean soldiers or became pregnant with these kids, Vietnamese women were supposed to remain pure until they were married, right? They're definitely not supposed to have kids out of wedlock. And this unfortunately was happening. And so the villagers or their friends or even their family would view them as defiled or as women who sold out their country, were blood traders, were carrying children of the enemy state. And so they were kind of, tied into the Dai Han as well. And then they were treated as quote unquote Koreans, the enemy. So as you can imagine, these women, these victims, and some reports state that there's about 800 of them still alive today, were ostracized by society, and their children could never find a place to fit into what Vietnamese society expected. And it's not just about, oh, you're mixed, or you can't fit in, or you look different from us, or you don't speak our language. It has nothing to do with that, though those might have some slight indications. But most of it is because they are living memorials of the terror and brutality of the South Korean troops at the time during the Vietnamese War. And as we know, in Vietnam, democracy did not win out after the war. It was a communist state. And so these children were also reminders of the democratic South Koreans who had come and tried to take over. Now, when Vietnam became a fully communist nation, then what happened to these children, right? They couldn't find a place to fit. And many of them, in fact, I believe all, as I can see by the limited information out there, live in acute poverty still today. Couldn't go to school, or they suffered a lot at their peers and the people around them. So the war ended in 1975. That's when the South Korean troops left Vietnam. And after the end of the war, of course, there was a lot of this talk about what should we do about these children, primarily coming from the US, because we can't lie that, of course, there were some war kids as a result of American soldiers also being in Vietnam. So in 1987, US passed the Amerasian Homecoming Act to help resettle children of American soldiers, to offer these children American citizenship, to let them have a better life in the United States, because they would never be accepted in Vietnam. And so the US did maybe accept about 20,000 of these Amerasian kids to come to the US. But South Korea, notably, did not do that. And so the South Korean kids, the mixed Korean Vietnamese, were left behind. Vietnam treated the victims and the children very badly. They were reminders of the enemy. If you look up stories on, I think it's called like Vietnamese stories, there's a YouTube channel where they have these interviews with some of the Dai Lai Han, and they will report stories about people telling them to go home. Go home where? Go home to Korea. It's kind of crazy when you think that still today, this is a very common insult for mixed kids, right? Go home to your home country, even if you're born and raised in that same place. The victims and the children lived in poverty, shame, stigma. There was prejudice. A baby out of wedlock was taboo. And so the Lai Dai Han have been relatively forgotten and beaten down. And the Vietnam government actually turned down BBC's requests multiple times, who wanted to make a documentary about the Lai Dai Han, but they continually turned that down. And as of today, I do not see any documentary on these people. So that seems to be the current plight of the Lai Dai Han from the war up to today. So how has South Korea responded now to these children? Well, first, we can see historically, they did not recognize the children as their own. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because after the war, all the way up until about 1999, it was just relatively forgotten about. People didn't really want to talk about it. You know, the troops came back. They were hailed as, I guess, heroes, even though the Democratic side didn't really win. I mean, when it came to that war, were there any winners? But there was a woman named Koo Soo-jung. And Koo Soo-jung, now the director of AMAP, a social venture that arranges fair trade and fair travel between South Korea and Vietnam. And she's a member for the South Korean Vietnam Peace Foundation. Now, she is a remarkable person. She was the very first person to bring attention to Korea through a newspaper called Hangyore in 1999. So she was studying in Vietnam, and she spent about 17 years doing research and learning about what happened in Vietnam, how the South Korean military and the troops, how they behaved while they were there, and all of these things that happened in Vietnam that Korea wasn't aware of, that the people back in the motherland didn't know had actually happened. Because if you remember, Park Chung-hee, you know, with his military dictatorship, a stranglehold on what happened, and then painted the image of them being as heroes. So she went around recording interviews and meeting people and trying to give press interviews, and she wrote articles after all her research, 17 years, to spread news about the civilian massacres that had been carried out by the South Korean troops during the Vietnam War. As you can imagine, this did not go over well, especially with the Vietnam Veterans Association of Korea. Because the Vietnam War didn't end until 1975, and she published this in 1999. That's not too much of a gap of time to feel disconnected to this war. And the veterans, when they saw her publications, flipped a switch. Here I have about 2,000 Korean veterans went to her home and trashed it up, and then they had to move. But come to think of it, 2,000 is quite a lot of people, but I wouldn't put it past it. Let's just say a lot of the Korean veterans were infuriated by this. And even though she had spent many, many years compiling documents and recording interviews, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Korea still today says that's all false. None of that is true. The veterans claim there was no gender violence that happened, and they would excuse any civilian deaths as Viet Cong disguised as civilians. In 2016, Koo Soo-jung, as late as 2016, some police officers came to her home saying she was being sued for defamation through the publication of false info. And apparently, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Korea now had finally garnered up their strength, and they decided to sue Koo Soo-jung for her defamation of them. They even went to the president, they went to the prime minister, the defense ministry, and foreign ministry to take action, saying, oh, she's spreading falsehoods about us. And they even went as far as to say, why do we have to make any reparations to the Vietnamese people when we did nothing? That case was dropped eventually. But you can see here the potential hypocrisy of Korea being very vocal about Japanese abuses happening to Korea, yet Korea remaining strangely silent about the own abuses they committed in Vietnam. There is a statue called the Vietnam Pierre statue, and it was set up in Jeju Island in 2017. It's a statue of a mother, and she's embracing her child. On that statue, it says, creating a world where the marks of hatred between South Korea and Vietnam disappear, and only love remains is my task and yours now. This is one of the poems that is inscribed on the statue by the poet Tan Tao. This statue was basically meant to appease the mothers and their nameless children that were slain in the civilian massacres by South Korean forces in Vietnam. This was not put up by the Korean government, but actually by a civic group that has been doing a lot of work to help these victims from the Vietnam War. This was in 2017 when they commemorated the 50th year anniversary of the Vietnam War. The artists who made this statue were the same artists who made the statue of the young girl symbolizing the comfort women, the Japanese comfort women, which has controversies in its own right. Now, why doesn't South Korea want to openly admit or at least do investigations in these rumors or these interviews or these personal stories? It is rather complicated. It's sort of foreign policy choices, it's domestic politics, wartime difficulties, and culture. All of these things mixed together. Today, South Korea has close economic ties with Vietnam, and nobody really wants to review their role in the war, why they did what they did at the time, which in reality was mostly for economic purposes, which South Korea admittedly really needed that help. There's a South Korean journalist, Ko Kyung-tae, and he is the one who first published Gu Soo-jang's controversial findings back in 1999. And he says the idea that South Korean soldiers had carried out these atrocities, it just doesn't really fit in the nation's psyche. There's sense and belief in themselves being a victim, right? And quote, "We Koreans say that we have 5,000 years of history and we've always been the victim. We've been colonized by Japan, Magnolia, China, and we endured it. It's kind of like we're proud of our victim mindset." So you have this mindset being really held tightly to by the Korean people, and it is true. In a way, it is true. Yet, why we cannot acknowledge, or if we're going to hold on to this belief so firmly, there's no room to admit that maybe we were the oppressors at some point. A foundation that was established in 2015, still pretty recent, called the Korean Vietnamese Peace Foundation. Well, the president of that foundation visited Vietnam to apologize for Vietnamese civilians who lost their lives in the massacres. And then in 2019, actually, the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, they sent a demand to the South Korean government to take action and bring justice to the victims of gender-based violence by Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War. So we know that the South Korean government is aware that people are making these demands, and they ask for some kind of apology, not even reparations. If you see how some of the victims talk about it, they say even just an apology, just an acknowledgement would go a really long way. Now, the Lai Dai Han people themselves submitted an open letter to the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the UK and Northern Ireland, demanding investigation by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights and DNA tests of Korean soldiers. South Korea responded with a statement that was probably best described as lukewarm. This is the statement that they released. Quote, "The two countries have made together continuous efforts to develop their bilateral relations in a future-oriented manner on the basis of the shared view that they should put their unfortunate past behind them and move forward to the future." AKA, stop talking about it. It's essentially saying it happened in the past, so it doesn't matter. Kindly putting it, it's not a very empathetic statement. And we see that, okay, maybe South Korean government moved on, maybe South Korea moved on overall, but the victims did not. And South Korea and Vietnam government as well have power to help the victims and acknowledge them and stop stamping them down. So what's going to happen? I don't know, but we'll get into that. What can be done? People are going to say, like if I look at this up on YouTube or I'm checking out vlogs about this, it's always, opinion pieces. People, especially some Koreans, will leave comments on there that say like, we have talked about it. We've already mentioned it. We've all apologized so many times. What more do you want? And it's true that Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, Moon Jae-in presidents, they have mentioned in their public statements, the history of gender-based violence during the Vietnam War, but none of it really acknowledged the victims. It doesn't do anything for them either. So now the question, what can be done? The Korean Vietnamese Peace Foundation was formed, I believe, in 2015. And their goal is to educate on peace for future generations. They want to give an accurate outlook of history. They want to study and publish and archive documents on the war so that people know the truth and people don't forget. They want to promote peace, reconciliation, and have exchange programs between South Korea and Vietnam, and they want to bring to light the truth about the war and support the war victims. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check out the Korean Vietnamese Peace Foundation. There is also another organization that is the Justice for Lai Dai Han, and they tell the stories of the victims. They are the ones who asked for apologies from the South Korean government. They're campaigning for that right now. They are a group of policymakers, writers, and artists, and they're fundraising efforts for the Lai Dai Han to help support them as well and their families. Something that I just have to keep emphasizing, this is so today. This is not past history. It's an entire forgotten generation of mixed Koreans that had been forced to live such tragic upbringings, and almost every Dai Lai Han child was born from their mother being violated by a Korean soldier. So there's no happy beginning to this, but I believe that together we can hopefully bring peace to and healing to the Lai Dai Han even today, even though it's so late. In 2020, Nguyen Thi Tan, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation, she became the first Vietnamese to sue South Korea over war crimes. This is 2020, guys. This is super recent. I think this was in April. Her whole family was killed by South Korean troops. And so some lawyers for a democratic society, they are now investigating the lawsuit on behalf of Nguyen Thi Tan, and she's 60 years old, a massacre survivor. And she's asking the South Korean government to pay her about 30 million won in damages, which in reality is only like 25,000 USD, which seems like peanuts compared to losing your whole family. But she and about 102 other victims submitted a petition to the Blue House asking for them to investigate on this particular massacre. But at this moment, the official position of South Korea's Ministry of National Defense is that we don't have any military records. There's no information about the civilian massacre. However, we do know that there is an official record of the massacre that she is recounting, and this was from an audit report by the U.S. military. It states that about 69 people were killed in this massacre. So right now, lawyers are investigating this during the upcoming trial, and I believe it's going to be within the next couple of years, most likely. The South Korean government and Nguyen, they're expected to debate whether this was actually South Korean troops that carried out the massacre. Another point of interest is whether a Vietnamese citizen has the right to sue the South Korean government for state compensation. A South Korean citizen can, but this case will ask the question, can a non-South Korean citizen then also sue the Korean government? So this could be quite a controversial and very important case. So keep your eyes open for that. I think it should be quite interesting to keep up with it. That was quite a lot of information that I threw at you right there. And I really hope that you kind of understand what's happening here and what I'm trying to tell you. We talk about war as if it's some faraway thing, as if it's something that happened 1940s, World War II, D-Day invasions. But in reality, people are still living today as if war just happened yesterday. Then there are also mixed Koreans, people who are living a very different reality than, let's say, mixed Koreans in South Korea right now. So, and this is of no fault of their own. And it is very hard to even acknowledge, from South Korea's perspective, that those people even exist. And South Korea doesn't want to acknowledge that they have rights to being South Korean citizens because, well, Korea doesn't openly acknowledge that South Korean troops committed these atrocities, that those children even exist. And they are helpless to do because they don't know who their fathers are, especially if the Korean government doesn't want to allow any DNA testing. And as you know, the Vietnam Veterans of Korea is very vocally, aggressively stating that, no, none of these crimes ever happened. So it is a sticky situation, and we'll see how it unfolds over time. But in the meanwhile, if there's anything that you want to do, if you want to help support these families, or you just want to learn more, of course, you can check out the foundations that I already mentioned, and I'll just put them in the link below on the YouTube channel. So make sure if you're listening to this podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, you also check out the YouTube channel. when it's released there. So that's it, guys. That was a handful of information. So Lai Dai Han people, on the off chance that any of you guys are listening or you know anyone who is in that circumstance, we'd love to hear from you. If you know any more information about that, you can always get in touch at thehappyproject@gmail.com. It's time for listener mail. All right, listener mail. This is a time that I love. So we always get messages from you guys, and so interesting to read. You know, sometimes your emails even bring me to tears because I just feel so moved by your stories and just so completely honored with your honesty. So for those of you who have been writing in, thank you so much. I read everything, and I'm always sharing it with the team, and I'm pretty sure they get a little bit annoyed when I send another email, and I'm like, guys, look at this great message. And like, oh, okay, it's great. Thanks, Becky. You know, I'm kind of the emotional drive behind everything, I think, but it doesn't make them any less important. So thank you for writing in. So we have just a couple of emails I wanted to share, and if this is you who are writing in, well, thank you. And this is, here is our message. Let's see, from Jinju. Let's say their name, Jinju. Hello, Becky and Cedric. Sorry he's not here right now, but he'll come next week. I am a half Korean from California. I've been searching for a platform like yours for a long time. I'm slowly going over your videos. I recently watched your video on the origin of the term hunyeol. Thank you so much for discussing this term and sharing more information. I've never been sure about sharing my story, but after watching you two be able to be so open, I felt a lot of gratitude. Thank you, Jinju. So good to hear that. So just, she shares more about her story. Her father was a Dutch American who worked for the United States Navy. Mother is a Korean American who came to the United States at a young age. She talks about more of her story, and it's funny because you make some points in here, Jinju, that I think a lot of, especially Korean Americans, can relate very strongly to. Trying to learn Korean language, asking to go to Korean language school, but not having a very good experience, you know, only learning the Korean alphabet. Still wanting to speak Korean in the hopes of better understanding my family. That was a huge driving force for me to learn Korean. I worked really hard at that. So she goes on to say, my mother saw this in me and began to tell me stories. My Korean family immigrated to Hawaii in the 1970s. My mother moved to California in the 1990s. The family around me was not from my grandfather's side, but my grandmother's. They were not Kimhae Kims, but Jeonju Kims. My great-grandparents were my grandmother's parents. Wow, this is a tongue twister. My great-grandfather's aunt, his father's sister, was married to, and then she mentions the name. During the time of the war, my great-grandmother and all her children crossed the Han River, oh my goodness, during winter in order to make it to his summer home where they managed to survive. My grandmother was one of those children. Now I've started learning Korean again in the hopes of visiting Korea one day, despite having only the most bare bones plans. I recently found my mother's immigration papers. Her old address is written on it, and it is my dream to see where she was born. Oh, thank you so much for writing in, Isabel. That's a very meaningful email, and I see a lot of myself in this message. I also, I remember when I was 16, I really wanted to visit my mom's home as well and to understand my own harmony and her story. And it's been a continuous journey ever since then, just studying harder and learning more and connecting. It's very hard to reconnect with family and your roots when you've grown up so differently or so far away. But that being said, it makes it no less valuable, and all the effort will pay off. So thanks for writing in. All right, here is our next email. This is from Fiorita. So what a beautiful name. Anyway, Fiorita is saying, hello, I just wanted to say that my spouse and I love you guys. We are avid fans. Avid? Oh, thank you. If there's any way to pass that on to someone, please do. Oh, well, just telling everyone here now. Also, I was curious if you could please send me a few stickers, pins, samples, or other promotional items to display. Even though money has been tight on us during COVID-19, we'd like to support you. Thank you very much and happy summer. Also, I'm not bot or spam. That's great to know. Fiorita, I'm so happy that you're not a bot or spam. If you were, you're extremely convincing. First of all, thank you for expressing interest and hoping to support us. Honestly, just spreading the word really makes a big difference right now. Sharing these podcast episodes, getting people to subscribe. Ooh, you can leave a comment and a review on Apple Podcasts. That is extremely helpful. And just sharing the YouTube videos, we're just getting the word out some more. As for promotional items, I have been thinking a bit and we've been getting a couple requests. So if anything comes out, I'm sure you will be the first to know. That's it for today. It's weird not having Cedric Skysetti to be like, anything else you'd like to say? And then he drops some emotional wisdom for everybody. But that's it for now. So thanks so much for tuning in, you guys. Of course, make sure that you subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can watch on the YouTube channel. Subscribe for more. Leave a comment below or send us a message at thehappyproject@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We are The Happy Project.